Now, Michael Gove has been giving evidence at the COVID inquiry this morning. This is the former Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has been urged to tell the truth to the inquiry when she appears later this week on Wednesday. This after conveniently deleting all of her COVID WhatsApps. Well, joining me now to discuss what's been going on at the COVID inquiry while we've been on air is TalkTV's international editor and, of course, the Lockdown Files whistleblower, Isabel Oakeshott. Good afternoon to you, Isabel.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Well, you've been watching this, so we don't have to. Much appreciated. Now, the key thing here is Michael Gove is he's appearing in Edinburgh. We've got the sort of the Scottish leg of the COVID inquiry going on. We've heard from the First Minister currently, Humza Yousaf, at the end of last week. We're going to be hearing from the former First Minister in charge during the pandemic on Wednesday. We'll get to her in a moment. But key thing about Michael Gove, he's levelling up secretary. He's still a very senior figure in, was a very senior figure in government. Crucially, during the lockdown period, during the pandemic period, he was one of the 4 decision makers in government, wasn't he? Can you just explain, first of all, just how significant a figure he was in that decision-making process?
So it may come as a surprise to people who weren't really following in detail how the government was working at the time of the pandemic to know just what an important role Michael Gove played behind the scenes. He was absolutely one of the key figures in devising lockdown policy and in decision making around every aspect of what the government was doing to control our lives at that time. And slightly strangely, given his sort of previous ideological positions before the pandemic, where he might have thought that he would be a sort of libertarian, perhaps more instinctively aligned with Boris Johnson in feeling very reluctant to tell the nation what to do and how far they could stand apart from each other and whether or not they could see their friends and so on. Michael Gove was actually one of the arch enforcers, somebody who behind the scenes appeared to be continually pushing for things to be ratcheted up. And he worked hand in glove with Matt Hancock, the then Health Secretary, to try to get the Prime Minister at that time to do what the pair of them wanted the Prime Minister to do. So the focus of this morning's hearing has not actually been broad brush about what was going on in terms of decisions that were made in Downing Street, because the point of the inquiry, the public inquiry we're at the moment, is up in Edinburgh, and it's looking at Scottish policy and the Scottish response to the pandemic. And what Michael Gove has been talking about this morning is the relationship between the 2 administrations and how functional or otherwise that was. And he's been talking about a basic lack of trust between Nicola Sturgeon and Matt Hancock and the Downing Street-led administration at that time. Essentially, the way that certainly Michael Gove and Matt Hancock saw it at the time was that they did not trust Nicola Sturgeon not to try to exploit this public health crisis to pursue her own agenda, namely independence for Scotland.
Indeed. I mean, this was established very early on in the pandemic, wasn't it? It was Boris Johnson would do his press conferences in Number 10, and Nicola Sturgeon started her daily press conferences at lunchtime, not in the evening. And then she carried hers on for far longer than the Westminster government did. And we know there was a lot of devolution of those powers. Wales did different things, Scotland did different things, Northern Ireland very different from the UK government's control of England. But it's again and again, it's come up in the evidence that Michael Gove has been giving about. He said he recalls Number 10's fear of divergence for its own sake. And we'd seen previously, hadn't we, that kids in schools in England ended up wearing masks for 8 hours a day for months and months on end in English schools because Nicola Sturgeon had done it in Scotland and they thought it wasn't worth the row, but there was no evidence for them. So we can see there's already been, the Scottish influence on what happened to everyone else was huge.
And this was appalling. It truly was. We know this because of the leaked WhatsApp messages between Matt Hancock and other advisors. Essentially turned out that these poor school children were muzzled for no good reason other than to avoid a big row with Nicola Sturgeon. We know also that the government, the UK government, got pretty early on in the pandemic, got to the point where they basically tried to keep Nicola Sturgeon out of meetings because they didn't trust her not to leak them, and they felt that they had very good reason.
I mean, that
for
was
that.
fair. She did leak decisions, didn't she? She would
She did.
often make an announcement. They'd know there'd be a big announcement, and then she would go ahead at lunchtime and make an announcement herself. I mean, they were both as bad as each other.
Absolutely, and we've also seen during the evidence sessions last week, one of her key advisors basically it came out in evidence, and from some of the limited WhatsApp messages that have been available to the inquiry from Scottish Government figures, that they decided to have a row with the UK government just for the sake of it, or as the advisor put it, because they quite liked the idea of a rammy, which is a Scottish word for a bit of a punch, a metaphoric punch.
Well, there's a quote apparently that Michael Gove had said it was something of an understatement to say that Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon were not soulmates. I mean, tell us something we don't know. But there's no doubt at all that during this period, while Boris Johnson very popular early on, but then less and less popular, particularly among many of his Conservative backbenchers over lockdown measures and reactions from people like you and me campaigning against lockdowns. But in Scotland, even when Nicola Sturgeon had an even worse record than Boris Johnson on things like deaths in care homes and even the death rate, the R number, all of these things, she maintained an incredible level of popularity. Now, that has disappeared in a flash since she resigned in the emergence of this police investigation into missing funds and her being interviewed and obviously released without any charge, but also the row over trans prisoners, rail rapists being put in cells with women prisoners and the like. But also now it's emerged that Miss Squeaky Clean Nicola Sturgeon has, along with government policy, decided after the COVID pandemic had ended, deleted all of her WhatsApps relating to this entire period. Talk us through that policy and that decision.
I mean, why would anyone do that unless they felt they had a great deal to hide? And I've no doubt that there was all sorts of treasure buried in, not even particularly buried, I mean, all there for the picking if only these messages hadn't been deleted. We know just how much was decided, discussed, highlighted in these private exchanges between key figures, key political figures at the time. Arguably, we found out far more of the truth of what was really going on behind the scenes from these WhatsApp messages, because they're contemporaneous. You know, they were unspun, they were raw. You know, most politicians at the time weren't actually thinking that these WhatsApp messages would at some point be all made available to the public through the inquiry. So they've been extraordinarily useful as a primary source for getting to the bottom of how decisions were made and whether those decisions were flawed and what should be done next time round. Because that's the point of the inquiry. It's to try to learn lessons, that old cliche. And in deleting those messages, all those who have done that north of the border have made the task of this already, frankly, deeply flawed inquiry all the more difficult. You know, this is already a colossally, ruinously expensive exercise. You know, to have politicians actively thwarting it by behaving in that way is extremely disappointing.
And indeed,
and you know,
I was going to say the use of WhatsApps as well. I mean, this abject breakdown of the normal processes of accountable government, minute taking, so we know what people said, who said, all the relevant people being in the room instead of just the Quad, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, now our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the Health Secretary, and Michael Gove. They literally made all decisions themselves, and Dominic Cummings, really, in the Westminster government. And we know similar things were happening up in Holyrood as well. But also, you know, absence of proper cabinet meetings. When they were held on Zoom, ministers were kept on mute. They couldn't speak. Parliament not sitting. These are the processes, as irritating and long-winded as they often are, that keep our freedoms protected and protect the government, you know, proper governance of this country. And the fact that they were doing everything on WhatsApp and then decided, oh, whoops, Isabel Oakeshott's got a hold of a load of them. Let's make sure we all delete ours. I mean, come on. This is so blatant, isn't it?
Of course it is. And those processes that you talked about also maximise the chances of there being alternative viewpoints getting serious
Yeah.
consideration. And we now know that there were a number of cabinet ministers who would very much like to have had the opportunity to push a different approach to the lockdown, but their voices were not included at all. They weren't really, they were shut out of key decisions. I think it's also worth, as this Scottish inquiry, this Scottish segment rumbles on, just worth a bit of context, because the puff has gone out of the Scottish independence campaign for the time being. It may be a bit difficult to imagine just how live an issue that felt to be, casting back to the years of the pandemic, 2020, 2021. Scottish independence at that time felt much more of a genuine threat. The SNP was in a far more powerful position, and politicians down in London and those in Downing Street were genuinely very, very worried about that juggernaut gathering any further pace. And throughout the pandemic, that was very much at not just at the back of their minds, but at the forefront of their
The
minds.
key thing is they
as
weren't
dealt
following the
with
science,
their colleagues.
they were following the politics. Isabel, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on and telling us what's been going on there. Mike will go over the COVID inquiry. It's going to be fascinating watching Nicola Sturgeon on Wednesday, that's for sure. Thank you for joining us.